I'm here to talk about conservatism and the future of culture, and my first reaction to the request to give this talk was to ask myself, what culture could they possibly be talking about? So the title of the talk is Culture, What Culture? And in order to illustrate the points I have to make, I'm going to take you to a scene in Jacobean drama. It's, in fact, one of the roaringest scenes in English comedy. It happens at a kind of Renaissance Punch and Judy show. It's St. Bartholomew's Day, actually pronounced in those days Bartlemy. St. Bartholomew's Day, and the good folk of London have gathered for an earthy and merry celebration called Bartlemy Fair, complete with hawkers selling hobby horses and gingerbread, a lovely young lady engaged to a complete oath. This is not a new thing in the world. Pickpockets, widow chasers, a justice of the peace in disguise, an enormous foul-mouthed she-bear of a woman named Ursula, afflicted with the colic and selling roast pig. That's a figure you'd want to meet. And a Puritan blowhard, pinned with the great name, Zeal of the Land Busy. Got all that? There's a puppet show, too, wherein the classical tales of the lovers Hero and Leander, most recently celebrated by Christopher Marlowe in the poem Hero and Leander, are jumbled up with those patterns of self-denying friendship, Damon and Pythias. Since the author, Ben Jonson, wants to have some fun with what he saw as the current cultural degeneration of his trade, the trade of a playwright, he sets this puppet show on the shores of the Thames. Leander is the son of a dyer. Hero is a tart. And their dialogue features such flights of amorous poetry as these from Hero. Oh, Leander, Leander, my dear Leander, I'll forever be thy goose, so thou'lt be my gander. To which Leander replies in kind, and sweetest of geese, before I go to bed, I'll swim over the Thames, my goose, thee to tread. Treading, as evidently Mark knows here, and some of you do not, is the technical term for what Mr. Sparrow does to Miss Sparrow when the showers of April and the warm west wind have set their hearts a-fluttering. But then Damon and Pythias arrive, and they, it seems, have also had their share of Hero. When they see Leander kissing her, they cry out that she's a whore. Hero responds by inviting them to do something not mentionable in polite society. And before you know it, the puppets are all pummeling one another about the heads. Something has to resolve the chaos, so the god descends from on high. And it really is, in this case, a deus ex machina on handles and strings. It's the god of the theater, Dionysus, of course, dressed up as a petty schoolmaster, upbraiding Damon and Pythias. Then all at once, this Puritan, who's been wandering about the fair causing trouble, Zeal of the Land Busy, bursts through the audience of the puppet show to put an end to the festivities, to put an end to this popular culture here. Down with Dagon, he cries, as if he were Samson tied to the pillars of Gaza, ready to bring the theater down upon the heads of the Philistines. Down with Dagon! 'Tis I will no longer endure your profanations. Now, the Puritans had long had an animus against the theater. They and their sympathizers in Elizabeth's court, and Elizabeth had a few sympathizers with the Puritans in her court, had managed to put an end, for instance, to a nearly 400-year-long tradition of bumptious religious pageants, so-called mystery plays, that the crafts guilds of every little town in Europe would put on for the Feast of Corpus Christi. Shakespeare has evidently seen them. He refers to out-Heroding Herod in Hamlet. He is clearly seen a mystery play in which Herod was blustering about, ordering the massacre of the innocents. The Puritans were not fond of the trade theaters on the wrong side of the river in London either. they would rail against them for attracting all kinds of ruffians and whores, and for their encouraging the dangerous lust of the eyes. Johnson refers to their antipathy in the prologue to the play, and you may be surprised or pleased to find that this play was evidently performed, its inaugural performance, in front of King James. Says the prologue, "Your Majesty is welcome to a fair. Such place, such men, such language, and such wear you must expect. With these, the zealous noise of your land's faction," he's talking about the Puritans here, "scandalized at toys, as babies, hobby horses, puppet plays, and such like rage, whereof the petulant ways yourself have known and have been vexed with long." James and the Puritans were often at loggerheads. "These for your sport, without particular wrong, or just complaint of any private man, who of himself or shall think well or can, the Maker doth present, and hopes tonight to give you for a faring true delight." Now, there is a happy end in Barnley Fair to this attempt at the destruction of culture. Busy is enticed into an argument on the merits of play acting by the puppet Dionysus. Dionysus has descended, zeal of the land breaks in to disrupt the festivities, and the puppet and the Puritan get into an argument. The Puritan loses. The climax comes when Busy repeats a standard criticism of the plays in that time. Says Busy, "For the male among you," he intones, evidently quoting Leviticus, and also it was not clear that zeal of the land Busy had ever really been to any Jacobean plays. "The male among you putteth on the apparel of the female, and the female of the male." "You lie," says Dionysus, "for puppets are neither male nor female." And to prove it, he lifts his garment for all the world to see. Be converted, he cries to the Puritan. "Let it go on," says Busy, "for I am changed, and I will become a beholder with you." I said there was a happy end to the attempt to destroy that culture. I am not sure there will be a happy end, or there has been a happy end to the attempt to destroy ours. 60 years ago, in a book called Leisure, The Basis of Culture, one of my favorite books, Joseph Pieper wrote that Western Europeans were rapidly forgetting what it meant even to possess a culture at all. His reasons, I believe, are borne out by this wild scene that I have just described, which I'm going to use as a touchstone for the points that I want to make in my paper today. I'd like to ask what made that scene possible, conceivable, or rather what makes anything like what it portrays impossible to find anywhere in the West today. All right. And when I asked myself this question, I thought, well, I should start with the most obvious point. Most obvious and perhaps therefore easiest to miss. Ben Jonson's play is called Bartlemy Fair because it is celebrated on St. Bartholomew's Day, St. Bartholomew's Day, and it is a fair. It's celebrated on a saint's day. That particular saint's day was a kind of Protestant nationalist religious holiday, commemorating not just the feast of the Apostle of Christ, but the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris, instigated by Catherine de' Medici in the 1570s against the Protestants. It's celebrated on a saint's day, and it's fair. Anything may happen at a feast or a fair. So Shakespeare's Rosalind in As You Like It, "Come woo me, woo me." She's disguised as a boy pretending to be a woman, right? Beguiling her days in exile in the forest of Arden by teasing her beloved Orlando, who doesn't know that it's she. "Woo me, for now am I in a holiday humor, and like enough to consent." The holiday humor can find fit place in a forest for music and silly talk about love. In Bartlemy Fair, it finds a large-hearted forgiveness for the scruffy and rough-tongued antics of the fairgoers, and can give us entertainment, evidently, fit for a king. In fact, it is the feast, properly speaking, that clears room for a fair, and one of the objects of modernity Pieper suggests, and I think he is right. It's not just Pieper, Romano Guardini in a book called The Death of the Modern World. First, I believe Guardini first invented the phrase mass man to describe a new kind of, and a very truncated kind of human being. One of the objects of modernity, says Pieper, has been to turn us all into proletarians. I'll have more to say about this soon. But, he quotes Plato in the Theaetetus, it is only in the feast that man can stand up with shoulders unbowed and dwell in the light of the gods. Or to glean wisdom from the Old Testament, it makes no sense for us to be delivered from bondage in Egypt, only to fall into the deeper bondage of an existence without aim, without God to praise, without the feast that attends the praise. So, says the Lord to Moses, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Note that it is not mere inactivity that the Lord commands of his people. Otherwise, why should he command that even their resident strangers and their servants, their animals, should do no work either? If the purpose of the Sabbath is to rest the machine called body, that purpose can be attained on any day of the week, regardless of what anybody else might be doing. But it is precisely the nature of a feast, rather, that everyone be invited to it. You cannot have perhaps a feast made up of individualists. And that it be directed towards something beyond the work of the other days. In other words, God reminds his people that their work itself is to partake of the exuberance, the freedom of the feast. It is the Sabbath of praise for which the world in the very beginning was made. Now, it is by such freedom alone that man makes culture. This is more than civic liberty, as important a thing as that is. It is not the same thing as spare time, as Pieper points out. And the very phrase suggests something snatched for private use or private waste from the tyrannical demands of work. Well, I have some spare time now. I wonder how many husbands or wives say to the spouse, well, yes, now let's have some happiness here because I have some spare time. We got 8 minutes. Strange, that is. Consider what the ancient Greeks did for their feasts. All but the wealthiest among them knew work that would put us to shame, for its demands upon the endurance of the body or the skill of the hands. Think what it is like to hitch yourself to a team of oxen and to guide a heavy scratch plow using intelligence and main force to keep it in a straight furrow in the stony plains of Greece. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, boasts about the excellence of his plowcraft. He's king and he plows. Even the wealthy and sophisticated Athens were expected to train their bodies and minds at the open-air gymnasion should their city need them to fight. You were supposed to keep well fit if you were a man until you were about 50 years old. But when it was time to feast, well, it was time to feast. Whether they were at peace or at war with one another, and they were often at war with one another, the Greeks from Athens and Sparta, from Aegina and Corinth and Thebes, and dozens of other city-states would come to Olympia to celebrate the games in honor of Zeus. Note, not to pursue some individual dream to win a medal and be known the world over and get commercial contracts, but to celebrate what it means really to be human in honor of that Zeus who grants to human beings the rational capacity to govern themselves in their own small city-states. Or they would go to Delphi to celebrate the games in honor of Apollo, the slayer of the Python. Pindar, that roving crafter of song. Pindar might grace a young victor with one of his odes, many of them almost incomprehensible to us now, for their crowded allusions to the stories that the Greeks knew and revered and passed down from one generation to the next over the course of centuries. Yet, these songs were not meant for the erudite, right? Because they were passed down that way. They were meant for mankind. Any man, if blessed, might enjoy for a brief moment the best life has to offer, that is, the favor of the gods. Says Pindar, man's life is a day. What is he? What is he not? A shadow in a dream is man. But when God sheds a brightness, shining life is on earth, and life is sweet as honey. The feast has the power to embrace us all. When Sophocles wrote his hymns extolling the glory of man and reminding us of our limitations, Sophocles, who I believe was deeply conservative, thousands of Athenians from city and seacoast and countryside, intellectual elites and common bricklayers, perhaps plumbers named Cleon. Joe is a Hebrew name. It's Cleon the plumber. Women and even children heard him in the great theater of Dionysus. And so, according to venerable tradition, did Dionysus. This was not mass entertainment, folks. It was not even entertainment in any way that we can conceive. It was part of a civic and religious festival. They left a seat open for Dionysus to hear the plays in his honor, for the god himself to be present and to behold the festivities. Man is most free and most human when he is freely silly, in the old sense of that word, innocent and blessed. You still see it in the German word selig, a fool for the divine. When man celebrates a holy day feast, he has a chance, for those hours too brief, to be a child and to be wise. It is then that distinctions among men come the closest to vanishing, when we really do manage to achieve something like a genuine democracy. The very word celebrate in Latin suggests crowding together. Cannot be a feast in honor of ourselves, that is but self-absorption with food. Cannot be a dinner for making your way in the world, hobnobbing with important people. It cannot be a fundraiser for the candidate you believe will return the most money to your pocket. If the Lord does not build a house, they labor in vain that build it, says the psalmist. But if the Lord has built a house, the house, how grand a thing it is to go up to it, not alone, but among one's brothers, says the psalmist. It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, that went down to the skirts of his garments. Blessed and foolish Aaron, dripping with oil. We find that happiness, that fullest expression of a thriving culture, almost impossible to imagine, as we have almost entirely lost the sense of the holiday, the holy day. For we might paraphrase the psalmist thus, if the Lord does not call the feast, they cry in vain that call it. By the way, I am Roman Catholic. My Roman Catholic Church in the last few decades decided on the immensely silly and totally modern and in its own way quite anti-cultural expedient of allowing us to forget a feast if it happened to fall upon a Saturday, right? Because that would just mess up the real purpose of our existence, which is the weekend, to provide for some bodily rest in the pursuit of total work. My church must be guided by the Holy Spirit because no human intelligence seems often to be at the helm. Except for the boss and the late boss, Boss Benedict. Look at our paltry attempt to establish holy secular feasts. They reflect not the establishment or preservation of culture, but its evisceration. We took that fine day on which America once remembered the sacrifice of her men in the horrible trenches of Flanders and the Argonne, the day called Armistice Day. I remember when it was called that, because that was the day when World War I ended, And we shifted it to some Monday or other, I cannot remember which, tacking upon it the innocuous name Veterans Day, and obscuring, necessarily, because it now produces a long weekend, obscuring the significance of the Sunday before it to boot. So have we also done with the day in May, Oblivion Day. Oblivion Day, the day whereon we forget the liberty for which our fathers gave their lives. So have we done with Residence Day, the day whereon we ignore the men who resided for a time in the White House, two among whom, Washington and Lincoln, we used to revere around that time for some benefits or other we believed they had conferred upon us. So would we also do with Dependence Day, were it not for the embarrassing fact that it is otherwise known by its specific date, the 4th of July. We have made the very phrase national holiday almost a contradiction in terms. Can anyone tell me what is holy about Labor Day? I do not wish simply to mourn the loss of a vaguely Christian culture, though I do mourn that. I am noting the loss of culture itself. Whether we like it or not, it is an historical and anthropological fact that culture without cultus, the faith that binds a people, does not exist. Culture without that does not exist. What is left to set man free from work and even politics for the heartiest enjoyment of his fellow creatures on earth, together across the generations, even across the centuries? What would be left? The people of Ben Jonson's day were in this sense far freer than we, for they had feasts and we do not. And in the spirit of those feasts, from the ordinary Sunday to the raucous fairs on St. Bartholomew's Day, they composed the songs and poems and plays that knit them together or helped to knit them together as a people. And even if Englishmen were fighting Englishmen, there was still that odd bird called an Englishman to do the fighting. Whether there is really now such a thing as an American, I think we can argue. Now, here, somebody might object. We do have a culture, you might say. You might look down upon it as shoddy or stupid or debased, but it's still a culture. We have sports, just as the Greeks had. No, not quite, really. We have music. We have plays. We have Broadway. We're Americans. Behind the objection lies the assumption that a conservative critic, and I think conservatives need to watch themselves here a bit, a conservative critic of American culture must be looking down upon its supposed degradation. Now, that might be a very fine thing to do. That's not what I'm doing here. The objection would be that this is just an exercise in snobbery. It's not high enough for him, not sober enough, not enough like an Edwardian gentleman with a lot of money. But that would be severely to mistake what culture means, or at least how I'm using the word today. And look again at that scene from Johnson's Bartlemy Fair. Its humor depends upon a fund of knowledge shared among the audience. They may have had, as Johnson said of his friend and fellow actor and fellow beer drinker, Shakespeare, they may have had little Latin and less Greek, but they knew something of the stories of Damon and Pythias and of Hero and Leander, not to mention who the god Dagon was from the book of Judges in the Old Testament, why it was deliciously appropriate to have a Puritan argue morality with a puppet representing Dionysus. This shared knowledge was not in Johnson's day mainly the result of formal education. That's another key. No doubt education had a little to do with it. Schoolboys were given Damon and Pythias as exemplars of friendship. And anybody with a trace of familiarity with Catullus or Ovid would have known who Dionysus was and why you wouldn't want to pick a fight with that boy. But to attribute that knowledge to the schools and leave it at that is already to have begged the question, for it requires a vibrant culture to cherish the memory of Catullus and Ovid and the Old Testament book of Judges in the first place. And that is the second lesson, which I draw from that raucous puppet show. There is no culture without memory. In the memory of a people, distinctions between high and low art fade into relative insignificance. This is another factor in the uniting of people, especially democratic people. How culture can do this. How would you characterize, for instance, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, wherein high speculations on the predictive value of dreams and on predestination and on the ancient Roman philosopher theologian Boethius are carried on by two learned chickens in a barnyard? Or how would we characterize Dante's comedy? I doubt any television show will interrupt its plot soon to correct the director's Averroistic conception of the union of the rational soul with the human body developing in embryo, as Dante does in Purgatory 25. Well, that's high art, but what of the pack of leering devils in Inferno 21 and 2, straight out of the popular mystery plays, with their leader Evil Tail bending over, if you will excuse me, to make a bugle of his arse? What of the love poetry in the vernacular, culminating in Dante's praise of the one to whom his Beatrice always directs her eyes, the love that moves the sun and the other stars? How great was the fund of memory Dante could draw upon? Or how do we characterize the cathedral as Chartres? It's a compendium of theology, the essence of the Christian story of salvation portrayed in stone and wood and glass by ordinary craftsmen, most of them illiterate, but deeply at home with modes of thought that we can often only recover after study and deliberation. A modern student can read Augustine's Confessions and mistake it for an autobiography, rather than seeing it as an attempt to teach what it means for any of us to dwell in a story, that is, in a world made and redeemed by a providential God. We might make that mistake. Roger the blacksmith at Chartres, steeped in that culture, and it was a true culture, if he had any brains at all, would not make that mistake, though the local clerk would have to tell him what the letters on the page meant. Shakespeare could write his history plays. Indeed, he could establish himself as a playwright to be reckoned with only because he knew that his audience, his fellow Englishmen, knew about good Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the Humpty Dumpty of nursery rhyme, and wanted to know what made him fall. Or that they understood that hunchbacked Richard was a villain, and they wanted to see how God, working through history, would give that murderous dog what he deserved. It's not enough to say that Shakespeare took his plots for his Roman plays from Plutarch's Lives. The people who unbuckled their purses to pay for their admission wanted him to stage a play about Julius Caesar. They wanted Jonson to stage a play about Sejanus, the treacherous henchman of Tiberius. These characters were a part of their mental universe. What do we have that is comparable? And I do this experiment with my students all the time. I did it this fall again at the beginning of my Milton class. Milton, of course, is the one person of his day about whom we can be absolutely certain that he never read Paradise Lost. But he had it here. And I recall to my students that the neighbor of an old professor of mine, a wheat farmer in Saskatchewan, used to recite Paradise Lost to himself. Not a passage from, but the poem, as he worked the fields behind the plow way up there in Canada. People used to have these memories, funds of song in their minds. Then I asked them to complete this phrase. Rice-a-roni, the. That gets them. And that's what we have up there. We have nothing that's comparable to what Jonson, Shakespeare, Dante, even the illiterate carvers at Chartres could count upon. Suppose I announced to 100 Americans that I was going to write a play on the old age of one of the most fascinating figures in American history, J.C. Calhoun. I have a few Southern partisan friends who would cheer me on. Mostly the reaction would be boredom or incomprehension. Who is J.C. Calhoun? Suppose I were to sing a ballad on the exploits of one of Pennsylvania's favorite sons in the Revolutionary War, Mad Anthony Wayne. Must be some great ballads on Mad Anthony Wayne, which I don't know. How else would a man get the name Mad Anthony? The reaction would be puzzlement. Was he a murderer, maybe? Or suppose I should refer in the middle of a presidential debate to Webster's reply to Hayne. Or recall while stumping through Iowa, and if we are to credit our news reporters, this stumping is about the only thing a visitor goes to Iowa to do. Suppose I were to recall the 9th Amendment to the Constitution. We've just endured the great quadrennial national exam. Neither one of the major candidates referred to the wisdom of the Constitution. In fact, the report came late that one of them referred to the inanity of the Constitution, because the Constitution, in fact, seems to have been a constitution actually limiting certain powers of certain branches. Neither candidate reminded us of what our revered statesman once said and did. The so-called conservative, Mr. McCain, did not broach the shrewd pessimism of John Adams. The leftist, I do not use the word liberal, you will note, because I want in my old-fashioned liberals a belief in what was once called liberty. The leftist, Mr. Obama, did not turn one page of the pamphlets of that revolutionary Tom Paine. Just as we have lost a sense of the holy, so have we lost our national and cultural memories. For without reverence, the past is but a burden of irrelevant particularities, which historians may study if they so choose, but which most of us will cheerfully ignore. And that amnesia is one of the conditions of enslavement. For just as our apparent freedom from worship helps to enslave us to the state and its tentacles in mass entertainment, mass education, mass technology, since there will be no Sunday against which to judge the everlasting Mondays of modern life, so our apparent freedom from memory only enslaves us to manipulation by what I call the anti-culture, the infantile fads we take in helplessly from our keepers in the media and the schools. A man worshiping God on a Sunday with his brothers in a tumble-down chapel is free, receiving the gift of the world and giving praise freely in return. Man commemorating the birthday of Stonewall Jackson is free, receiving his heritage in gratitude and passing it along in turn as a gift to his children. But when I am in an airport, that most harried image of the eternal tarmac of hell, crowded without community, noisy without celebration, technologically sophisticated without beauty, and see people engaged in loud conversation, not with one another, but with a business partner in Chicago or a spouse and children far away, I see not freedom, I see an image of confinement. And above them all, as if to remind us of our unhappy state, blare the everlasting televisions, telling us what has just happened and what it means, and preventing us from ever experiencing a moment not of loneliness, but of solitude, not of idleness, but of peace. It, too, is a tool of the anti-culture. For culture, by its nature, is conservative. It remembers. It reveres. It gives thanks. It cherishes. A farmer tilling the land his father tilled, whistling in air from of old, in the shadow of the church where his people heard the word of God and let it take root in their hearts, that is a man of culture. Even should he live only 50 years, he would live them in an expanse of centuries. Indeed, under the eye of eternity. I'm still waiting for the popular news weekly called Eternity. Instead, we have time. How thin and paltry our 70 seem by comparison. For we are imprisoned in irreverence. Our preachers are neither the birds nor the old pastor peering over Holy Writ, but the nagging, needling, desire-pricking, noisome voice of the mass educator, or of the headline, or of the television, which could never have won our attention without encouraging in us amnesia, indifference, petulance, and scorn, all of them destroyers of culture. In this sense, the left are like Johnson's Puritan without the faith. In fact, I think a good arguments have been made that liberalism was Protestantism without the theology. Leftism may be a most virulent form of Protestantism, a kind of Calvinism without salvation, even for the few, even if they recycle. I don't know. The natural conservatives in Johnson's Bartlemy Fair are on the side of king and commoner. They're people who want their roast pork for the simple and almost, sub-rational reason that they've always had it. What's wrong with it? Who don't mind the carnival, who will deal with pickpockets and charlatans as they come. It's the ideologue who wants to establish the kingdom of perfection on earth by decrying homely and earthy and generally innocent traditions such as you'll find on a Saint's Day at a fair. "Hinder me not," cries our purveyor of the puritanically correct Mr. Busy. "I was moved in spirit to be here this day, in this fair, this wicked and foul fair, and fitter may it be called a foul than a fair, to protest against the abuses of it in regard of the afflicted saints," he means his afflicted fellow Puritans, "that are troubled, very much troubled, exceedingly troubled with the opening of the merchandise of Babylon again, and the peeping of popery upon the stalls, here, in the high places." Does the citadel admit only young men to turn them into true men, boys to turn them into men? Oh, the abuses of it, the foul abuses. Are the children of the local high school singing Christmas carols? Down with Dagon, down with Dagon. Is there a teacher somewhere speaking about the forgotten virtue of purity? Tear down that superstitious shrine. Or our new Puritans have improved on the old in this regard. They manage to be lewd and prudish at the same time. Now, if I am right about this, then conservatives who attempt to win what have been called the culture wars run the danger of making a category mistake. There have been no culture wars because there has been no culture. There have been mass entertainment wars and mass education wars. Maybe some of us ought to fight them. I honor those who fight those wars. And yet I have the word of a wise carpenter from Galilee that one does not cast out devils in the name of Beelzebub. Because I am a conservative, or rather because I am a man with a natural longing to praise and to give thanks, I cannot be content with mass entertainment, even if it should be clean, or with mass education, even if it should refrain from turning its patients into idiots. I cannot be content with them, as I cannot be content with living in prison, even if the prison were a nice hospital with decent food and social security checks. I want the genuine article. I want culture. But I don't believe I will live to see it. And that is because of two more lessons I glean from Johnson's play. The first is simple enough. Bartlemy Fair was produced by his company of actors. They were all male. Young women were played by boys. You all knew this. Now, I am not saying that Hollywood should return to this practice. It may be a very dangerous time for Hollywood to return to that practice. I am quite content with Maureen O'Hara and Ingrid Bergman. Thank you. I do not need to see Tom Cruise in a dress. Frankly, I don't need to see Tom Cruise. But the cultural dynamism of that particular kind of group, the all-male group, is another historical and anthropological fact. The ancient Greeks, indeed, believed that it was a sign of a barbarian, that is, a sign of somebody who had to endure being governed by despots and their bureaucrats. Okay? the sign of a Persian, if a man were embarrassed to be seen naked by another man, since it was upon the training ground of the gymnasium that the Greeks formed the civic and intellectual bonds that made their liberty possible. Or for a Christian, the icon of the memory-preserving brotherhood is that band of brothers, the apostles. A Christian must assume that Jesus knew what he was about when he chose men. That Jesus therefore looked down upon women is a charge that not even his enemies make. Indeed, all of the villains in Jesus' parables are male. Think of that. That is not true if you take a look at Old Norse mythology or Greek mythology. All of the villains are male. And Jesus' treatment of women is remarkable for tenderness without servility and respect without indifference to their womanhood. Yet he established a brotherhood within his church. That does not mean that men and women cannot unite in organizations such as the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Indeed, they should. They must unite. But in a free country and in a thriving culture, that freedom of association must be honored, which makes possible the brotherhood and the sisterhood and groups wherein the brothers and sisters come together. It must be honored because it is a deeply human thing. One of the finer things in life is lost when men are only allowed to come together so long as it is to drink alcohol and watch a football game, but not to serve the city as energetic brothers, as the JCs and Kiwanis clubs used to do. Something analogous might be said about the women's groups of old, those organizers of neighborhood charity that turned the civic good into a domestic good and brought bread and meat to beggars and their children. A really thriving culture will have room for men to be men and women to be women. An all-meddlesome secular state, however, will fear the strength of such brotherhoods, just as it fears the strength of the family, any institution that is a roadblock to its all-competence. It will try to legislate or litigate them out of existence, and so it has done already in America. I suppose that a few Americans may yet believe in a freedom of association. That might in better times give me hope that I should once again see revived this thing that I'm calling culture. But unfortunately, the final lesson that my reading of Johnson's play has to teach us will be the hardest to learn. It will be as hard for people who call themselves conservative, sometimes with little justification, as for people who call themselves liberal, usually with even less. It is the heart of Pieper's book, and it is simply this. We can have no culture without leisure, which is a receptivity of heart and mind toward the beauty of what we cannot provide for ourselves. But just as the object of the modern state has been, as Pieper argues, to turn us all into proletarians by robbing us of Sunday, giving us the nothingness of the weekend in return, and just as we've been distracted from our forefathers by the empty promises of a utopian future, so we have not only lost our leisure, we have lost the very capacity for leisure. We are hamsters who would be lost without the treadmill. We have taken our energetic plying of the treadmill to be a great virtue. We should not know what to do without it. I actually consider the plight of people nowadays who desperately need to work to stave off loneliness and to persuade themselves that they have a life. That's very odd. Consider my Puritan's name. He is Zeal of the Land Busy. And his name suggests the busybody, the meddler, the troublemaker. But there's more than that. See, it's remarkable what changes in words reveal about the history of a culture, right? Busy was never considered really to be a word to denote something virtuous going on. It's usually a pejorative term, all right, until maybe a couple of hundred years ago when it seemed to shift. Busy, at least before Dionysus converts him, is an opponent of the spirit of play. In his noblest incarnations, we might say that Zeal of the Land Busy will become, for example, a William Bradford, who tolerated the celebration of Christmas among the unenlightened at Plymouth, so long as they didn't use it as an excuse to drink beer and get into brawls outside. But at least Bradford, as wrong-headed as he was about Christmas, beer, and brawling, Bradford was still the real founder of the American Thanksgiving. He knew how to celebrate too, and to pray in peace. What we have done is to exalt busyness to a great virtue, when at best it is a corruption of diligence, and at worst the physical jitters attendant upon a deep and abiding sluggishness of spirit, as Pieper says. It's the old medieval sin of acedia, otherwise known as sloth, and a society engaged in total work is most prone to it, and that vice will be most invisible to it. Bradford worked hard, but he was not sluggish of spirit. The history of Plymouth, he wrote by his fireside, shows on every page the signs of a man who could contemplate in humility the strange and wild land to which God had brought him, and sometimes the strange and wild people that God had brought with him to that land. But we who work not a tenth as hard as Bradford did have not a tenth of his time. Perhaps I should say a tenth of his fruits of time. Since a minute being William Bradford at peace with his fellow man and with God is worth an hour of being what we are. For we moderns are everlastingly busy, notes Pieper, and that is paradoxically the surest sign that we are mired in that sin of sloth. But that busyness can create no culture. It is antithetical to it. We are unleisurely, says Aristotle, so that we may have leisure. And we have leisure so that we may enjoy the highest pleasures of human life, the beauties of art and music, intellectual conversation with friends, beer and brawling, and most of all, contemplation. Even the materialist poet Lucretius understood that. He glances with wistfulness upon a life without busyness, as he speculates on how early man might have discovered music, says Lucretius. And the winds whistling in the hollow of reeds taught them to play the rustic hemlock pipe. Then little by little they learn the sweet complaints that the pipe pours forth at the fingering pulse of the players, heard in the trackless forests, the shepherd's dells, places of sunlit solitude and peace. I don't know if Lucretius is right about the invention of the flute, though it sounds plausible enough. You discover music not in bustle or hard work. Can anyone struggle to be inspired? You discover it in the quiet of attention, in places of sunlit solitude and peace. The Latin reads, otia dia, shining or divine, nothing to do, as of a cloudless sky. Christian writers too have sought that peace. We primitive moderns have reimagined heaven as the realm wherein all our daily appetites, often of an ordinary or even tawdry sort, are fulfilled. So, for instance, when my beloved Jack Buck of the St. Louis Cardinals died a few years ago, there was all this sentimental tripe about his now watching baseball in heaven. I do agree that heaven needs baseball in order to be heaven, but it seemed to be a far piece away from what the primitive folks, what the really enlightened folks in the Middle Ages believed about heaven. The poets and theologians of the early church and the Middle Ages taught that the highest end of man was the intellectual vision of that infinite beauty who is God. Beloved, says John the Evangelist, referring to Christ, it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. The motto of the monks was orare et laborare, to pray and to work. And even if one does not share the faith of those monks, one must come to terms with man's call to contemplation, a call best fulfilled when men are at peace and almost impossible to fulfill in the midst of the busy. That's why when he enters earthly paradise, Dante has a dream of a beautiful lady culling flowers in a meadow. It is work, but not for work's own sake. She is Leah, the less beloved wife of Jacob, traditionally associated with the active life, for Leah, suggests Scripture, had weak eyes, That is, said the church fathers, eyes not fit for the very heights of contemplation. Those heights were therefore associated with her sister, the more beloved Rachel. Says this lady to the dreaming Dante, let anyone who may demand my name know I am Leah, and I go to make myself a garland by my lovely hands. Here I adorn myself for the delight I will enjoy when looking in my glass. My sister Rachel never leaves that sight, but gazes in her glass the whole day through. She for her lovely eyes, I for my hands. Her yearning is to see, and mine to do. What we have done is to split the monastic motto. We believe in work, but oriented towards nothing but the fulfillment of our appetites, which we are sometimes pleased to call our dreams. We have split Rachel from Leah and turned Leah into a shrew, hard-bitten, prim, and busy. Consider for a moment the great change in the labor force, a change that not even a self-styled progressive like Charles Reich in The Greening of America could foresee. The mass exodus of women from their homes to place their hopes for what will count as a real life upon work which they may not really like, as men may not really like theirs, among people they do not really know or love, for wages most of which they will not get to keep. I'm not arguing that such a life is good for men and bad for women. I'm arguing that such a life is deeply anti-contemplative for both men and women, and that our now total commitment to that life spells the death of leisure and the death of culture. It is the life for which we school those creatures who might, if we were healthy, burst through the walls of our workaday routine and return us to reality. That is, to a Bartlemy's Day fair, or to places of sunlit solitude and peace, or to Dante lost in wonder at the beauty of Beatrice. I'm speaking of children. We treat them as, at best, pleasant interruptions of what is really important, the treadmill of life. Then we prepare them for that same life. We do not give them the blessed indolence that Keats praised. We do not set them to swing on white birch trees as Frost did. And there's nobody here who could claim, I suppose, to have done more physical labor in his youth than Frost did, and yet he had the leisure to swing on birches. No. We warehouse them. We ship them off in yellow packing crates on wheels from one noisy learning center, and I think that noun center, with its abstraction and its inhumanity, says it all, from one learning center to another, to produce beings so harried with so thin a spiritual life, so used to being busy, yet so ill-equipped for either hard work or vigorous play, that they will be proof against culture. They will take their entertainment canned for them to settle their jangled nerves. And that is it. What should we do then to restore culture? I have no 5-year plan. No 5-year plan for the production of joy. I give you no flowchart leading inevitably to insight or inspiration, nor can I invent any machine to harness the Spirit of God. I will say that we must restore not culture, but the preconditions for culture. How to do that? I think I can leave the details to you. I mean, we can speculate on that. No doubt you will be able to think of some interesting measures, perhaps involving a television and an axe. I sometimes think of them involving those large brick buildings, utterly ugly, where no human being would want to go. They look like factories or prisons because they achieve some of the same purposes. Schools. And a very large acetylene torch. Sorry. Mostly what I'm calling for is the result not of work, but of a change of heart. We must, if we are to have a culture, turn again to the great elemental realities of human life. To married love, to children, to the neighborhood, to work and play, and to the community of worship. We must turn to them not as our personal and therefore arbitrary choices, but as the ground of our being human, not as things that make life pleasant, but as things without which life is thin and poor and hardly worth our bother, hardly a human life at all. And here too Johnson can point our way. At the end of Bartlemy Fair, there is a real conversion back to those great and simple things. The justice of the peace, a man named Overdue. He's got his funny kind of similarities with Mr. Busy. He's a good man. We might say a conservative on a mission from God. He has roved in disguise about the fair looking for pickpockets and harlots and other genuine abusers of public order. He's also on the lookout for his wife, Mistress Overdue, and his ward, Grace, who has agreed, while he does not know this, to marry a dashing fellow by the name of Winwife. In the end, the good Overdue has overdone everything and gotten it all wrong, and has unwittingly given away Grace's hand in marriage. The last word belongs to the groom's friend, who does not gloat over Justice Overdue. He reminds him cheerfully of what he is. Remember, you are but Adam, he says, flesh and blood. You have your frailty. Forget your other name of Overdue and invite us all to supper. There you and I will compare our discoveries and drown the memory of all enormity in your biggest bowl at home. And the justice agrees. The play ends with a betrothal, the reunion of Judge Overdue and his wife, and a feast to come. Shall we have a culture again? Go home, marry, love your children, feast your neighbors, work and play and worship, and remember. Thank you. So the literature person is at an unfair advantage. I get to talk about bawdy puppet shows. We have time for some questions. Yes?
John Boyd, federal Jesuit literary critic over at Fordham, spoke in my last doctoral course, and he said, Ed, you know, I give to my freshman advanced students papers, Leisure the Basis of Culture.
Yes.
And, I'd never heard of it and read it at that time, and it opened up this whole new world to me. That, you know, busyness wasn't everything and just doing all the time. And I find it rather encouraging that the movement within the Catholic Church of contemplative outreach seems to be growing and growing every year, where people do meditation and kind of connect with monastic life in some way. I myself have connected with a monastery just to kind of associate myself and become an outlet. But I just applaud that, you know, bringing up people and some people.
Thank you. I stumbled upon Pieper's book and then other books by him about 10 years ago, and well, I think it's not too much to say that these sorts of things can change your life. The connection of the sin of sloth to busyness was an amazing one. As yet another case of the wisdom of folks in the Middle Ages, Pieper points out that Thomas Aquinas said that sloth was essentially the sin against the Sabbath. Now you might think that excessive work would be the sin against the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is all about feasting, vigorous feasting. And sloth is that inability within to enjoy a feast. It is perfectly compatible with the society of work that we've constructed for ourselves. This is Pieper, and he's quite right about that. I am very gratified to see that interest in him is really resurging. I stumble upon him now in journals all over the place. Yes?
You point out, you know, as a literary person, you're able to sort of show us the influence of language and how language is shot through.
Yes.
Joseph Kubata of
Sure.
Church First Things recently did a piece on the demise of Protestantism, and he finished off by saying that the vocabulary that was common to the American experience, namely because of this sort of anti-Protestantism, is on the way, right? We have no common vernacular, if you will, no common language
right.
that stems from the world. You have no problem, obviously, very versed in the literature. How might we, in this age, in our day, reinvigorate the language? I mean, you're harkening back to the 16th century, but instead of and mentioning things like for 200 years, you've gotten a good name.
Right.
How might we bring the language back to the fore? How do we recover?
This is an excellent question. We need to remember first that language is always essentially a communal thing, right? This was the gist of a controversial piece that I wrote for Touchstone a few years ago on the social and linguistic effects of homosexuality, just merely tolerated, shrugged at. What that does to language very broadly conceived. And people would object, well, no. If you throw an arm around your friend's shoulder, you don't have to mean anything by it as you're walking down the street arm in arm. But the point of it is that an individual is not in control of what a gesture or a word means. It's the entire context that gives meaning to those things. It's the community itself. We will reinvigorate the language when we reestablish communities. They will go together. I'm not sure which comes first. They are part of the same phenomenon. And I think there are some people out there, it's slow, but there are some people out there who are on to this. There's a kind of Catholic communitarian movement, a Catholic agrarian movement. I think there are some of these movements also among Protestants, especially Protestant homeschoolers and Protestants who establish home churches. Not simply as a reaction against, the flake who happens to be running the church down the street, but as grasping for something really central to human existence. To belong to a community, to share the same feasts. And part of that would be to share the same language. I don't know how it could be done otherwise. We have endured a massive destruction of human intelligence and wisdom since the time of John Dewey and perhaps before. In fact, if you really read him closely, I think it's fair to argue that Dewey was specifically about that destruction. It specifically says that we need to remove children from the undue influence of their parents, their villages, and their traditions, so that we could produce this vast, new, homogeneous, and united thing called American democratic culture. The man did not even know what culture was. He was a very smart idiot. And I mean idiot in its old sense. Somebody so wrapped up in himself and his ideas that he could go around lecturing people on what it might mean to have a community, while at the same time recommending the destruction of every community in sight. Anyway, yes?
This question your comments about remembering culture. I totally agree with you about the comments about how we are in time of embellishment in our culture. But I've heard it said that, for instance, our memory of, I'd say, films and movies are sort of our cultural stories of today. And there arguably is that memory. If you think of the push for Indiana Jones and things like that, where I'm not saying these are high culture or just like a good replacement. I'm just saying what sort of role have those sort of stories played?
That's a very good question. The film is an interesting phenomenon because I do think that you can have, and I find this with my young students too. They've actually watched movies that date back before 1980. Some of them, anyway. That you can have a kind of shared vocabulary. So you can talk about From Here to Eternity or On the Waterfront, my second favorite movie of all time, after The Bridge on the River Kwai. And there's something there that might, if other things were in place, do its smallish part in uniting a people. Beyond that, I won't go. Because, first, it seems to me that film is, although a very lively art form, it is a minor art form. I'm glad it's there. What would we do without it? We would hardly have any very fine art to speak of in the entire 20th century if it were not for film. But it's not on the level of the novel even, and it is certainly not on the level of songs and poetry, let alone scriptural verses, that people would carry with them in their minds and be able to meditate upon, to hear their own mind, to hear their voices in their mind's ear, speaking the words of Paradise Lost, the words of Satan, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It forms part of your very being and your outlook upon the universe. I'm not sure that film can carry all that weight. It can carry some. So some Christian conservatives have decided that it would be a good thing to have Christian films. I think that opens up another case of worms. But as far as it goes, yes. I don't think it goes far enough. I don't think sports will be a substitute either. Okay? Mass sports, I think, are also part of the problem and not the solution. The other thing about film that makes me hedge is that it has to be produced from far away. It has to be something marketed to the masses. We could talk about that some more. Two more questions. Two more? Yes, back there. With the tie. Yes, and then you, sir.
How does the internet change all this, if at all? You talk about lack of the health club and compliance and women's organizations, but the most of people are running differently along different lines. It may not be geographic, but platforms nonetheless.
I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We were talking about this just before the meeting started this morning. I've been considering, for instance, ceasing to blog. I write rather regularly for the Touchstone magazine blog site Mere Comments. And in some fashion, I find a kind of community there as I get to know people whose faces I've never seen, whose voices I've never heard, whose wives I don't know the name of, or children. Maybe once in a while I figure it out, and then I forget. It's a kind of desiccated and bloodless substitute for community. And it also lacks something central to community that Chesterton put his finger on in an essay about the family, some thoughts about the family and its critics. And Chesterton said that the tendency in mankind always is to veer away from a community towards a clique, towards a club. The real community is full of unpleasant people, like person next door. And that is why it is a healthy thing for mankind. People had been arguing that the family was not a congenial institution, and therefore it was bad for man. And Chesterton flipped it upside down. It is good for man precisely because it is an uncongenial institution. Because every baby comes into it as a kind of invader. And it ought to be invading that family. The alternative is the formation of clubs of like-minded people. And the internet, disincarnate clubs. Clubs are fine. I don't think that can be substitute for community too. I'm too much of a Roman Catholic and too earthy to discount geography and proximity. I think you can't have a community unless you come to terms with the unpleasant fellow who lives next door. Yes, sir.
All of us here would agree. We appreciate the presentations.
Thank you.
I'm particularly interested in the teaching whether your students' eyes light up with any recognition and understanding for the things that you presented to us today. And yes needs no explanation, but no requires.
I think the answer is yes, and this is the sort of thing that requires a great deal of meditation and even experience. That is, it's one thing to have your eyes open to see, well, gosh, I have bought so many assumptions of a political and social point of view that I thought I disagreed with. But I've imported so many of their assumptions into the way I live my life. That's not good. But on the other hand, there is this other thing over there, this move towards contemplation of beauty, towards the simple things like family and family love. I am drawn towards that. But that's just the first step, and then it requires, I think, we're all scouring the smoke and soot off, and that requires years. But that may mean being exposed to, I hate the word exposed to, it sounds rather like a misdemeanor. But learning to hear the poetry of Dante and actually asking yourself the wonderful imaginative question, what kind of human beings were these that took seriously the proposition that a man might see a young lady at age 9, not again until age 18, never give her a kiss, never hold her hand, watch her marry a local banker, and then die at age 24 or 25, and see in her a key to the mysteries of all the universe? If we could get into a little bit of that mystery, we would be different.